What's up, guys? Back at you with a little more Stoicism. There were some good questions that came from Matt and Samantha, after my last video, and these more or less related to the relationship between Stoicism and Buddhism. And I will note that in the long period of transition to being a irreligious type of person, I did go through a Buddhist phase, as a lot of people do, but I was pretty serious about the philosophy of it. I studied Nagarjuna and practice a lot of meditation and so on, and I still do. And I've been of the view that, you can distill Buddhism of its sort of religious precepts pretty easily, and there's a lot of neurobiological stuff about meditation, especially Buddhist techniques of meditation and show how therapeutic and helpful they are. And I've noticed in my life just, greater emotional control that comes from engaging in regular meditation. And this is because, our regulatory stuff is in the, let's not try to be like too heavily neuroscientific here. It's in, your forebrain, right? And that is the part of your brain that is shown to be active through meditation and so on. And it helps it develop it. That's what we're doing with children. When you're raising children, you're trying to get them past that immediate instinctual response part of your brain and work on that part of you which is able to evaluate emotional states, which is able to choose strategies and develop strategies and choose strategies for dealing with suffering and pain and self-criticism. So yeah, I still perform that kind of meditation. So the question that Matt had was, how is this related to, how is Stoic meditation and Buddhist meditation related? And, and this also, answering that question, I think answers a part of Samantha's question, which was about, or rather her criticism that she doesn't she holds the Buddhist view that we aren't our emotions, versus the Stoics would say, like, we are our emotions. Whatever emotional state we are in at that moment, that's what we are, because they have a unitary view of the subject. The subject isn't an entity which exists in this bounded space, and it has experiences and so forth. The subject, rather, is an entity which becomes that thing at that moment. It's transformed as a kind of push and pull imitation of perceptions, and that, for the Stoics, explains how habits come to be. For the Buddhist, they want to say, we're going to sit back and we're going to meditate and we're going to notice these things as they pass by us, and we're able to get a distance from those things. So if you sit in meditation and you try to do nothing, what you notice is something happens. All kinds of things happen. All kinds of thoughts and feelings and reflections and connections are made one after another that are very surprising. And the point of that type of meditation is to let those things pass without grasping them, without identifying with them. And the more you notice these things as they arise, to use the Buddhist terminology, the more you're able to be in a state of blissful peace, separating yourself from them, and you develop your own sense of who you are and your worth, absent those things which are always in flux, right? And that's the point, is we're trying to find some sort of state of relative, permanent happiness alongside this continual flux. So how does that differ from the Stoic model of meditation? Well, honestly, not that much. What I would say is, for the Buddhists, we have a bundle theory of the self. The self is nothing but a bundle of various processes and so on. And the thing, if you were to unravel it, there's nothing underneath. There's literally nothing. And that's kind of what's going on with Buddhist reflections on the notion of emptiness, sunyata. That's the Nagarjuna's philosophical distillation of Buddhism. It's really focused on that notion of taking things that seem to be substantive, that seem to be simple and bounded, and the more you dig, the more you find that there's nothing there. So we have to regress, analyze to the next level, and eventually we get to nothing. The Stoics would say that this is missing something essential to the structure of reality. The structure of reality for the Stoics, okay, let's contrast it with, say, the way Plato describes it in the Timaeus, which is very similar to sort of a Christian interpretation of reality. So in the Timaeus, Plato says there has to be essentially this entity, the demiurge, which is like a theistic god. It is transcendent in its relation to the world. It is separate from its relation to the world, and it creates it orders the world in a certain way. With the Christians, it's this separate entity that is infinite in all these different aspects, and then it, through its act of miraculous creation, out of nothing creates the whole world and shapes it. And thus you can see the relationship between the more God's hand is on the world, the more orderly it is, the more structured. The more God's hand is off the world, the less orderly, the less structured, thus the more pain and suffering. That's kind of the logic of original sin. So for the Stoics, they don't have a sort of Epicurean view, which dispenses with the God aspect altogether and looks at reason and order and structure as an emergent property of things. Rather, for the Stoics, all of reality is this interpenetration of these two principles, of the active and the passive, of the rational and what you would call maybe the irrational. So for the Stoic, there is a certain order of things within each entity which is preferable, healthy, and according to its nature. To use Aristotle's notion of nature here as that which has to do with a specific thing's internal principles of motion and how those can lead to what we would in modern day context call homeostasis, a relative stability. So the Stoics are not of the view that there is this immortal, immaterial entity inside, in some fashion, a physical body that persists after death and can move on to new bodies, as the Platonists will argue. There's a hard and fast mortality with the Stoics. And that's something they share with the Buddhists. Once the principles isn't the right term. Once the conditions for the existence of a self are taken away, the self is gone. The self is dead. It's dead and gone forever. That's shared with the Epicureans, the Stoics, the Buddhists, and so on. So, as you begin to unravel those things with the Stoic, what you arrive at is not a nothing at the heart of it, and that it is nothing more than a kind of effect of all these forces. Rather, a self is in this case, something like an emergent property that comes from the total structuring of what is to be the self. What I mean by that is, like, once things are aligned in a certain way, a body is aligned in a certain way, then you get a kind of entity which we can call a self or subject or, conscious entity. this has to follow all of the basic Aristotelian notions of what is life versus non-life. They've got to be capable of motion and reactions, and a kind of reproduction. But for the Stoics, as opposed to the Buddhists, the most essential element of that bundle that is structured in a definite way is that reason, the reasoning part, is the ruling part of that structure. In Greek, the term is hegemonikon, from which we get hegemony. If you're a Marxist, you've heard of the notion of hegemony. It's a kind of rule, and it's distinct from, we're talking about the, let's switch to Latin. In the late Roman rule, you had what was called the dominate, and that was sort of separate from the first among equals hegemonikon style rule. So what do I mean by that? A hegemonikon is a first among equals. It's within a certain element, it's the leading element, the vanguard, if you will, of the other entities that is fundamentally related to them. It's not this external ordering agent. It is a leading agent, more of a sense of the leader of a herd. A dominate, a dominus, domination is separated. There's a sharp distinction in an ordering and a ruling of a passive element. So it would be a mistake to look at this Stoic structure of reality in terms of pure domination. Reason isn't just this element within every aspect of reality which orders it in this external draconian way. No, it is rather enmeshed with it. It is part of it and is a leading part of it. Unless you have something like, a Taoist notion of the yin-yang, with the active and passive and different quantities of it and everything. And I mean everything. There's nothing that is purely active or purely passive in the Stoic view. Well, that's somewhat arguable. You might note that they do maybe have a concept of divine agents that are purely active in that way. But that kind of brings us back to another element that I think is interesting, connecting Buddhism and Stoicism and a lot of Greek philosophy. So for the Buddhists, you want to be in the human realm. You want to be in the human level. You want to be in this spot. And of course, that over against like animals and hungry souls on down the ladder who are just, pure passive victims of these forces drawing you back and forth in these different directions. But you also don't want to really be on that divine level, that divine realm, that godlike realm, where you're beyond all these fluctuations as a matter of course. You don't have the opportunity to understand emptiness and nothingness in the same fashion. And that's why, Buddhism is a kind of, even though in its most religious forms it does retain some notion of deities, it's still very humanist. It's very focused in its best versions on the human being. You see a similar thing with a lot of Greek philosophy. In the Philebus, Plato has Socrates and Protarchus discussing the nature of pleasure and knowledge, of pleasure and reason, and which one is greater, and so on and so on. But the important thing for us in this is that he notes that a divine being is a being that actually experiences no pleasure because it can never experience lack. It's in this sort of state of permanent fullness. And thus you can see that there might be something more privileged in a certain reading of Platonism, certainly not the one that kind of follows Plato, but a certain reading of Platonism might say that actually the humans who are in this cave state are in a much better position because we have a sort of privileged status between this noetic realm of pure thought with no motion, no suffering, but also no pleasure, and this sort of just abject everything's darkness and being pulled in every direction in the chaos of the material world. So Circling all the way back to this picture of meditation, a Stoic too, like a Buddhist, would say that it is beneficial to us to sit in a state of quiet contemplation in which you allow thoughts to arise and go and so on, and you therefore gain a distance from them and understand that you are something that is not just those thoughts. And I know this seems contradictory with what I was saying about the unitary subject, and for the Stoic, you are that thing as it comes. But when you are in that state, you're differentiating yourself. When you're in that meditative state, you're differentiating yourself in a certain fashion from those arising perceptions and so on. And so you are strengthening the hegemonicon, that aspect of yourself which is most rational. Now, there's some problems with what I've just described, and I think I could write a whole paper going through the problems with that image. Let me, though, go back to sort of my original inspiration for discussing how we become our emotions, to try to make some sense of what the Stoic view is. So I'm quoting here from the Era on Anger, Book 1, by Seneca, the Roman Stoic Seneca. For the mind, the word there is anima, like soul. For the mind is not a member apart, nor does it view the passions merely objectively, thus forbidding them to advance more than they ought, but it is itself transformed into the passion, and is therefore unable to recover its former useful and saving power when this has once been betrayed and weakened. For, as I said before, these two do not dwell separate and distinct, but passion and reason are only the transformation of the mind toward the better or toward the worse. And so this is where you get a sort of notion of the Stoics as anti-emotion. And there are certainly some Stoics who you can maybe find that, but it's not that it's anti-emotion, it's not anti the passions in general. There are good passions, eupatheia, which have to do with those the virtues that of the things that are in our control, and have to do with movement toward the better as opposed towards the worse. So, one more thing that I'm going to read from here. So how is we look at Seneca's account of anger in Book 2 of the Era to get a picture of how the mind as an active agent is also related to the mind as passive agent, as undergoing passions. Discussing anger, our opinion is that it ventures nothing by itself, but acts only with the approval of the mind. For to form the impression of having received an injury and to long to avenge it, and then to couple together the two propositions that one ought not to have been wronged and that one ought to be avenged, this is not a mere impulse of the mind acting without our volition. This is the one single mental process, the other a complex one composed of several elements. The mind has grasped something, has become indignant, has condemned the act, and now tries to avenge it. These processes are impossible unless the mind has given assent to the impressions that moved it. And this leads us to one more, I promised that I was done, but one more quotation that I think really lays out the way we move from an initial instinctual reaction to an emotion, properly speaking, in the Stoic sense. This is also from Book 2. Then you may know further how the passions begin, grow, and run riot, and I may say that the first prompting is involuntary, a preparation for passion, as it were, and a sort of menace. The next is combined with an act of volition, although not an unruly one, which assumes that it is right for me to avenge myself because I have been injured, or that it is right for the other person, blah, 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 blah. But whether or no, and has utterly vanquished reason, we can no more avoid by the use of reason that first shock which the mind experiences than we can avoid those effects mentioned before which the body experiences, such as the temptation to yawn when another person yawns. Such impulses cannot be overcome by reason, although perchance practice and constant watchfulness will weaken them. But different is that prompting which is born of judgment and is banished by judgment. So, why did I read that big long thing? Because Stoic practice and meditation is designed to get you trained in a certain kind of activity, in a certain approach to your emotional states that will weaken those initial prompts. This will be more successful for certain people than others, and that has to do with their physiological makeup. And the Stoics are hard materialists, and I don't really see any reason why they would disagree with that. But the more we practice these forms of meditation and learn to strengthen the side of us that is this active reasoning side, the more we are able to avoid those initial shocks and make judgments that lead to our flourishing and health as opposed to our self-destruction. Because all in all this comes back to a kind of ethics, eudaimonistic ethics, eudaimonic ethics, that is ethics that are about flourishing, the flourishing of an entity, of a person. They're not about doing the right thing in every situation. They're about cultivating a kind of ethos, a kind of character that leads you to flourish and realize your nature, your potential, your capabilities. And that's why, we often use the word ethics as opposed to morality when describing the Stoics, the Epicureans, the Aristotelians, and a little bit Plato, though Plato can definitely venture into the moralistic side of things. So, what does that overall meditative practice look like? Well, there's traditionally 3 types of disciplines. Some of this, it's distilled from the Roman Stoics. I imagine elements of it were definitely there with the Greeks. There's the discipline of desire, what it is proper to want or not want. There's the discipline of action, that is how to behave, how to act in the world. And there's the discipline of assent, how to react to situations. So, the first one of desires, it's teaching you, the basic meditative techniques are to teach us to want the things that are in our control and to want the good things that are in our control. So, this is where you get all sorts of virtues, which, again, virtue here, not in the moralistic sense that you get from later Christian theology, but rather, and morality, but rather virtues, the Greek word is arete. It's an excellence. It's a term that's used when describing athletes. They exhibit arete, they exhibit an excellence in the specific activities that they have trained in. And that's what we want to do. We're kind of athletes of our own mind and emotions. So, I remember one of the practices that I did at a certain point was to start off thinking of the qualities of somebody who I really admired and liked, and to kind of list them and contemplate what it is about those qualities that I liked, then to move on to somebody I didn't like, and to try to find qualities that were similar, that overlapped. And this is a good practice. I think it really helped me develop some empathy for people I didn't care for. Discipline of action, of how to act in the world. This involves, again, character. It's not, every situation doesn't have a right answer for everyone. Situations are in flux. There's a kind of ethical standpoint with the Stoics, the Epicureans, and others like them, which recognizes that situations call for dynamic judgment. Judgment requires that we know that we have this background character. Things are ambiguous. That's why there are judges. Things are ambiguous, and you have someone who is trusted to have good judgment to make a decision in that scenario that is sensible. Last one, the discipline of assent, is how to react to situations. And so, this involves things like negative visualization, contemplating the most horrible situation that you can every day, saying to yourself every morning, I'm going to come across people who are terrible and they're going to treat me terribly and they're going to be mean and they're going to make me sad. And if I go into the day preparing myself for that, then it allows me, when I'm in that situation, to have a moment. The more you practice, have a moment when something happens to you where you can reflect. Now, I'm drawn to Stoicism because this stuff doesn't come easy to me. And I am no sage. I am a very reactive, angry, pissy person a lot of the time. I get irritated very easily. People annoy me very easily. I can feel claustrophobic on a moment's notice. I'm also very opposite. Sometimes sometimes I can just be a calm, patient little sage in a situation. In the exact same situation the next day, I flip out. A lot of it has to do with the way my body operates. I don't really fully understand it. I know that if I don't get enough sleep and proper diet and a light exercise and some intellectual work, I'm going to lose my mind in most situations. So just pointing all these things out because I think that's important. Last thing is a sidebar. As we talked about Buddhism and its relation to Stoicism, the further question that Matt has was the relationship of Stoicism and any inspiration it had from other, for lack of a better term, Eastern philosophies. Now, let's just from the outset say all of the philosophical systems that we're looking at in the Greek world are a product of, this sort of Mediterranean civilization that's related. You have the folks in the Nile Valley, and they developed very extensive architecture and mathematics and so on. And you have folks in Mesopotamia who are doing incredible work with astronomy and astrology, and these things kind of come together with the Greeks. And the difference is who's doing it. With the Mesopotamian folks, with the people in the Nile, it's a priestly class that's very differentiated in an almost caste-like manner from the rest of society. With the Greeks, you had a series of historical accidents that led to these separate city-states rather than one contiguous entity with a strong bureaucratic centralized regime and an imperial figure at the top, and you ended up with these little city-states, and some of them ended up being relatively free. As a result, by the way, of enormous class conflict. Athens being the biggest example, where you had a series of peasant struggles against the aristocracy that culminated in the development of democracy, and democracy was a kind of solution to this problem. And what it essentially did was it freed these peasants from being subject to their aristocratic landlords, and they became freeholders and thus gained the independence to do things like go to the polis and vote and so on and so on. And as a consequence, the aristocracy then moved to a new model of taking care of its labor, enslavement of people abroad. And that is essentially why Athens became simultaneously a society with the most freedom and the most cruel forms of slavery at that time. It was the growth of a free peasant population that incentivized the aristocracy to move towards enslavement. So I know that's a big aside there, but long story short, the Greeks had a variety of different social arrangements that allowed for intellectual activity, especially the people in the colonies that were structured according to this principle of isonomia, that is a kind of egalitarianism. And they had separated from the old aristocratic orders. This is even before Athens is a democracy. And they set up these small commodity producing settlements all over what is today modern Turkey. Those are the people who became the pioneers of what people call the Greek Enlightenment, which is they had these motivations, they had this free time, they had all these things that allowed for them to experiment with astronomy, architecture, and thus geometry, and so on and so on. And that's what created the basis of Greek philosophy. Now, those people are all part of one broader social system involving the entire Mediterranean and on to Mesopotamia and eventually Persia. And then there's a major connection between that and the Indian subcontinent, where you've had a lot of development of intellectual life over the centuries. And somewhat separate from that is China, like farther away. Now, there is an interesting book by a guy named Beckwith called Greek Buddha, and it draws the connections between Greek skepticism, specifically Pyrrhonian skepticism that's separate from the skepticism of what was the Platonic Academy. That's sort of the mainstream skepticism. There's a separate one, Pyrrhonism, related to Pyrrho. And essentially, what this book claims is that Buddhism as an organized religious system emerged from an area called Scythia, and a sage there, and that Pyrrhonic skepticism is a closer approximation of what the earliest Buddhism was before Buddhism existed. So that, I think, should be a whole separate video. But I'm going to do it real quick here. So the standard claims are that Buddhism was founded by an Indian. The Pali Canon is a reasonable account of the Buddha's life and teachings. Buddha taught karma, rebirth, nirvana as release. Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. Taoism and Buddhism developed apart from one another. Buddhism emerged as a reaction to Brahmanism. Jainism, etc. were similar reactions. Buddhism emerged in a developing urban setting in the Ganges. Pyrrhonism was at best influenced by Pyrrho's visit to India. Now, Beckwith's counterclaims are Buddha was a Scythian, Shakyamuni, the sage of the Scythians, that the Pali Canon is 500 years past this historical moment. Buddha did not teach death and rebirth, but only the balanced skeptical arguments in the middle way, released not from the rounds of rebirth, but from the polarizing constrictions of metaphysical claims. Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path are not early Buddhist teachings. Lao Tzu may be of Taoism, may be Buddha. He has this linguistic derivation, from Lao Tzu, Lao Dan, Cao Dan, Gao, Gao, Gautama, Dao, Dawa, Dharma. In brief, there's a linguistic argument over of how these words can be related to each other, and how early skepticism, Pyrrhonic skepticism, and early Taoism represented in the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi are actually very close. We're all inspired by the figure that became associated with Buddhism. So I think that's enough for now. But it's an interesting thought. There's a lot of conjecture with this argument, but my point in highlighting it is that there are historical and just content connections between Buddhism and Greek philosophy, and that, there's nothing that prevents you from mixing and matching these things and finding ways to integrate them into your practice. I know that I do a lot of Buddhist practice in the midst of my Stoic meditation. It's just ingrained in me. I consider it a very secular, ordinary mental health thing to do, and it doesn't have anything to do with veneration of a canon of any kind or of a historical figure or any notion of salvation. This video has gotten really long. I'm going to let it go. Until next time, see you guys.